What's up, people? Yeah, I just went for it. So I hope that that's okay. Anyways, what's up, guys, to another episode of Nightmare Road. I am one of your hosts, Decon, here with a very, very spooky.
SOS. How are you guys,
And
peeps?
today, yeah, we're hip. Um, so today we are going to just tell like some stories, like some paranormal stories. Um, I'm not a big believer in the paranormal, but I do have. Well, I it's hard for me to say that. Like, I'm not gonna say I don't believe in the paranormal. Like, I believe in certain things, but I do have some past paranormal stories that I would like to share with you guys. Some just some childhood stuff.
Yeah.
And Miss SOS here, she's got some stories. She probably has like textbooks and textbooks of stories with her field here.
Yeah, I do, but I want to hear yours.
Okay, so this is. I wish I had one of those things where when you're watching a TV show and it's like, well, it all started, do 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 do
Doo-doo-doo-doo.
do do,
I do have some,
and
I
then,
actually have some music I could put on here, but I'll do that later.
oh, okay. I was gonna say it all started and dude, it's just black and white and it's just me with a big afro and it's like, what is going on there? Yeah. So, all right. So when I was a kid, we lived in these like really like crappy apartments in California in Van Nuys.
Oh,
And
nice.
yeah, up in Van Nuys. Oh, so dirty. Anyways, so we, I remember that we would be sitting there with my older brother, and we'd be at the kitchen table, and then all of us behind where we were, there was um, there was a closet door that would just slam shut like super hard. And then one night, when I remember, I got up to go to the fridge or whatever it was. So I went up and I went to the fridge, and then that door opened, and then it slammed like super hard. So like I don't know if anybody knows anything about air current or air pressure. Normally a door doesn't like open halfway and then just slam shut with a lot of force. So like it freaked me out and I'm like, "Oh man, so then stuff like that started happening. And then I remember that our bedroom door, you could just hear the knob turn, in in the middle of the night. And it was just like the oddest thing. So anyway, so then that happened, and it started getting worse and worse. So one day, our neighbor that lived upstairs, her name was Blanca. Yeah, so Blanca showed up. She showed up like at 2, 3 in the morning, and she was just crying so hard. And she came downstairs, and she was like talking to my parents, and she was shaking. And then my dad's like, it was like, you need to settle down. Like you're acting hysterical. Tell me what happened. So she ended up like she had like a sheet like around her and she ended up like taking the sheet off and she had like these really short shorts and she had these scratch marks that were going like from her knee all the way up to her thigh and then she turned around and her shoulders just had these massive like claw marks like all around. It was just like some deep gashes. And and they were asking my father was asking her questions like, so tell me what happened, who did this to you, tell me who did this to you. And she was saying that, so it's kind of an interesting story because she used to have a small daughter and she used to bring the daughter over to my parents' house like once a month to babysit. And then the her father was from Mexico and he would come over and he would come over once a month and he would take her out dancing and clubbing, all that kind of stuff. He would take her, and then he would hand my mother $600 cash. And it's like, here you go for watching the my daughter, and then they would leave. So one day, and I know this is I'm kind of going off on the tangent here, kind of going. So one day, there's a loud banging on the upstairs door, just boom, 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 and the FBI had come in and they were looking for this guy, and they pulled him out of the apartment. Turns out this guy was a member of the cartel. He was like running drugs, and he would come to the country to drop off the stuff and then collect the money, and then he would take out she wasn't even his wife. She was like one of his girlfriends.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and then he would drop off, give my mother $600. Here, watch the kid for a couple hours while I take her out. But anyway, so the point of that story was that she ended up telling my parents that when he got arrested, she started like experimenting like in dark magic, and she had like these candles and these seances and all kinds of stuff. And somebody told her that she could pass a spirit through her that would kind of like help her get him out of prison. And then she said that she was sitting there, and then she was passing this spirit, and then this thing like grabs her and like pins her up against the wall, and just starts like to claw her body. And then she crawled out of the apartment screaming, and then ran downstairs. And then it turns out that the next day she didn't want to go back to her apartment by herself. So she's like, "Can you come with us? Can you come with me?" And then we all went into her apartment. She had like all these black candles, like all these weird like necklaces and amulets, like riddled her whole apartment because she was trying to invoke this spirit. So after,
Well, go ahead.
so that after all of this happened, my father was telling her, he's like, "You need to destroy all these things." So then my dad's like breaking the medallions, like told her to throw all the stuff. And then after she got rid of all the things, the paranormal stuff actually stopped in the apartment.
Well, first off, be careful what you wish for. You
Yeah.
start playing around with dark things tend to go on. I mean, that happens, right? So it's like she wanted something dark, but it's kind of like those movies where it grants you three wishes, but it always screws up,
Yeah.
So yeah. Like, maybe make me super hot. You're an egg on the sidewalk. You know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah.
it doesn't always work out the way you want.
Make me super hot. It turns you into Tom Jones, and you're like, "What?"
Yeah.
I'm just-
Well. So, um, but yeah, it's interesting. Uh, I mean, did you ever, how long was she there after that?
So, she stayed in that apartment, if I remember, because I was younger. I still like
Yeah.
sometimes talk to my older brother about it because he has a better memory of it because he's older. He
Right.
said that she probably stayed like 3 months after that whole thing happened. Then she moved away. Um, so
But she
apparently,
was not bothered again.
that I don't know. I don't think so. Like a lot of the stuff stopped in the house. Like after she was gone, but he said that she was talking about how she was trying to pass this spirit that's going to help him get out of prison, but also she wanted to put a curse on the people that basically like ratted on him. So she
Yeah.
like summoned this thing to torment them, and it's like, well,
Well, it
I
sounded
mean,
like it backfired.
oh yeah, I mean, like, can you imagine if you have somebody living in your house and you're like, "I don't like this person. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna bring in a rabbit coyote." So it gets them, and you let this rabbit coyote loose in your house,
And it
you
bites
know,
you. Yeah,
and it bites you. You're the first thing it
exactly.
sees.
So, yeah, I mean, people do call with these kind of questions like this happened and that happened. And, like, what did you do? That's like, what have you done? Because
Yeah.
usually it's invited. Those dark things are almost always invited. It's really, really rare. There are cases of possession that are not invited. But usually, and even in a lot of those cases where there's possession of a child, usually somebody else in the family has done something and brought it in. So, yeah.
No. Okay, so when you say possession for those people
Uh-huh.
that the uninitiated, can you kind of like elaborate on that?
Well, it's something taking control of your body, your mind. We've all probably seen Exorcist and stuff like that. Um, there are true documented cases of actual possession, and on my other podcast, we talk about a few of those cases at length because they're pretty fascinating. I think it's the possession of Roland Doe. They gave him a name because how long this child was tormented. I mean, he was tormented for decades.
That that was a case where they wrote a book about it, didn't they? They wrote a
Uh-huh,
book,
yeah.
and then they just changed like the story and they made a movie out of it, right?
I
Is that where
think
The
they
Exorcist comes
have.
from?
I think they have. But see, his aunt was really involved in the occult, and I'm involved in the occult. There's nothing. it's all in how you treat things, right? I look for the light and do things with it, but I'm always trying to send protection to people and not harm them. But I don't know how she was involved in it, and that's what I mean. Be careful in what you do because energy is there, and you can draw negative and positive energy. So he was actually separated from his family and taken by the Catholic Church, and they tried many, many times to exorcise him. And he was actually institutionalized in a Catholic hospital. And it took like a decade or more. And still to this day, in that hospital, that that room is sealed because they said there's so many weird voices and phenomenon that happen at that room on the wing of that hospital that they don't allow anything to. It's bolted, locked.
Wow, that's interesting. Man, that is so crazy. Could you imagine something so bad happening that they're like, you know what, no one else can go? It's almost like being in a place where a nuclear device went off and you're like, there's so much radiation here that we
Right.
have to like protect people from it. You know, and what's interesting is I'm currently going to start reading a book. It's called Demonic Foes. And it was written by a guy that's a parapsychologist and also like a medical psychologist. And he like is employed by not just the Catholic Church, by other organizations where like this person says they are possessed. Can you take a look at them? And this guy will sit them down and give them a mental evaluation. He's like, okay, can you tell me, and because a lot of the things that happens is a person could be like says that they're possessed, and then it turns out they have like a form of psychosis, or the
Mhm.
family like doesn't understand schizophrenia of some kind, So this guy, his job is like rule everything out. Um, in that book, he tells a story of this young lady who they were like, hey, we need you to evaluate this girl. Can you please look at her? And he goes, yeah, I'll evaluate her. People that are near her saying that she's acting strange, she's speaking in different voices. So the guy starts giving, his thing, and he's like, okay, well, just asking her a bunch of questions. He's asking her questions, and then he's like, all right, can I see you in 2 days? And she says, sure. So she leaves. He goes home, and he's at home, and 2 o'clock in the morning, his two cats begin to fight like violently. They start fighting like violent to the point where there's blood everywhere. And his cats never fight that way. So so then a couple days later he goes back to work and he's still a little shaken up about the cats. He has to get the vets involved and all kinds of stuff. So then this girl comes in and she starts having a manic episode to where what people were describing, she goes into this, she starts shaking and she starts speaking in a low voice and she says, I hope your cats are okay. I just needed to get your attention. You know,
Mm, mm, mm.
And then he's like, okay, you know. So then this girl starts saying and revealing very personal things about him and his childhood and how his mother treated him, like all kinds of stuff. And before people say, well, like this is before the internet, this is before somebody can look something up on you.
Yeah.
So there's those kind of cases where people will begin to display some very unusual, like I don't even know what to call them, supernatural abilities. Like, man, see now I have another story. I'm sorry, I don't mean to. So, man, sorry, this story like it kind of bothers me a little, but I'll tell it. Okay, so when I was a kid in El Salvador, we used to we lived in a farm, and this was a rural area. Like to get to an actual town, it took 30 minutes, not because of the distance, but because the roads were so bad. Because in El Salvador, it rains a lot. So it's mud and you have to fight, to get there. So you get to a place where there's no electricity. The electricity is very limited. You can't run. Now there's electricity, but back then, this was like 1998, 1997, 1998. So only certain houses had electricity, and there was a thin wire that that would run across where you had to siphon electricity from somebody else. So you had like small fridges. You couldn't basically store anything. You had to have somebody like store things for you, or they sold things that were cold. So sorry, there's a demonic fly flying around here. Anyways, so I used to walk to this little store that was a house. There used to be this house, and I used to always walk past this house, and there was a little girl there. I'll never forget. I could live to be 100, and I'll never forget this little girl. She used to always like wave at me, and then I used to wave at her like, "Hey, Sandra, como?" Nice to talk to her, and then I just keep walking. So one day, I'm walking past this house, and I could see her from the window. Like, there's a little. Those houses are made out of mud, actually. They're adobe.
Adobe. Yeah.
So tiny, tiny little window. So I see her, and she just like has her head cocked at me like this, and she's just staring at me. And as I'm walking by, and I'm like, "Hey," and it kind of weirded me out. Like I got a really odd feeling from her. So I was like, "Hey, Sandra," and I'm walking by, and I'm like side eyeing her, and I notice she's missing clumps of hair. So I kind of walk past her, and she's still staring at me like with her head cocked in a really odd way, and like almost like she's looking through me. And I walk, and I go, and then I come back, and I look at her. She's still on the window, same position, same spot. And then I go, and I kind of talk to my parents about her. I was like, yeah, she was acting weird. And they're like, oh, she's just really sick. It's like, oh, okay, guess she's really sick. So a couple days later, I go to the store. She's no longer at the window. She's no longer at the window, and she's no longer outside. So I'm like, they ended up telling me she passed away. They're like, oh, she passed away. So I was like, oh, okay. Well, then that was normal. Kids tend to die from illnesses all the time in that region due to mosquitoes, unclean water and things like that. So many years later, many years later, I was told that they had. She one day started speaking in a language she didn't understand, and she had some people go over to her and like start reading to her from a Bible, and then she starts freaking out. She's chained to the bed, by the way, because they were afraid that she was going to run off and hurt somebody, so they had chained her to this bed. She started ripping her hair out, and it took 4 grown men to restrain this tiny little 5 or 6 year old girl, and they had to pin her to the bed and chain her. They had like put the chain, I think, like around her waist or something. So then one day, she ended up grabbing the chain and I guess wrapped it around her neck and like hung herself, like from that, like strangled herself to death. And then that's what happened to her. So it's just like it. And then when you talk to these people, a lot of, because there's no, um, so some people will say like, well, that's because of Christianity. They'll like take traits from Christianity, and they're like, okay, well, this is what's going on. Well, these people um, barely spoke Spanish. These were people that were indigenous, so they spoke Nahuatl. They still spoke Nahuatl. They still like mentioned a lot of things in the Nahuatl language. So they had like no real concept of Christianity because it wasn't there. It hasn't gotten that far yet. They were still like relying on each other and all that kind of stuff. So like it couldn't have been a concept of like, well, they probably told her about what demonic possession is, and then the little girl got so freaked out she made herself crazy or something like that. It couldn't have been that. But later, the people were saying that her body was inhabited by a bad spirit of nature that had like taken over her vessel. So they believe that when there's so much like negativity or death in an area, like all that negativity will actually like form into like an actual being, and it's supposed to leave. It's supposed to like leave, and you're supposed to kind of like shoo it away, I guess, in a way. Like you take all that pain, all that sorrow, and you form it into like a thing. It combines and turns into a spirit of some kind, and you do rituals to shoo it away. Like, get out of here. We don't need you here. But every once in a while, they said it's very rare, but this negative force will actually go and then seek what they say will seek water, or it's thirsty. So what it'll do is it'll inhabit a person. And I guess in this case, they believe that this stuff actually went and inhabited this young girl because it was like the most vulnerable. So that's a
Well, I
story.
mean, it's plausible. We have run into non-human entities here in Pocatello. I've run into them all over the country when I've investigated. Who knows? They're not human. They're not dead Uncle Fred. I say all the time in my group, that's dead Uncle Fred. It's a relative, it's a human, whatever. These things are not human. So who knows
Yeah,
what's really out there? We don't know. I mean, nobody, if you call yourself an expert in this field, you're a liar.
yeah, liar.
Because there's no expert in this field. We're just the sum of the experiences we have. And, if I'm investigating and you're investigating the same house with the same people on two different nights, we may have two different experiences. So my when someone comes to me and my team and says, "Help me with this," we may give them what we think is going on, but another team could get them entirely different information because it may not present the same for two different people or different teams. It may not be the same thing that came in night after night. It could be two different things going on. Who knows? It's just we're dealing with things that we don't know. We don't know 100%, and we never will.
Have you ever? Okay, so here's another story. It's not my personal experience, but this is just something that story that was told to me a long time ago. How there was these investigators, and they went to investigate a house because the door would open, or you'd be sitting there, and like a bottle will just like slowly scoot,
Yeah,
whatever. So then they're like, "We
yeah,
need you
yeah,
to come out here quick." So then this team goes out there, and this team is in there, and all of a sudden, like doors are now opening and slamming, and things are moving a lot more violently. And then it's like, oh, this place has got you have a very violent poltergeist. These investigators said. So then, one of the owners said that his grandfather, I think it was his grandfather or his great uncle, it doesn't matter. It was an old guy that he knew, and he's like, he can kind of like, he's very gifted, so we should have had him come out here first before you went out and called another team. So this guy comes over, the team is there like investigating, things are going violently, they're moving things, they're hearing my voice. And then the old man said that one of the team members brought something with him that,
yeah. It's possible.
and it's now increasing the activity. And he says, well, whatever's here, he says, is probably just passing through or is something that's benign, but now it's violent because this person. And then they start asking this guy questions, and he says, do you ever experience these kind of things? And the guy admitted that every once in a while, when he's in his home by himself, the doors will slam and things will move, and he's also going through a divorce, he's going through a hard time. So whatever negativity was in his home, and he's out there and he's investigating, I guess he brought it with him. And they don't know if it was an entity that he's bringing in with him, or the negativity, kind of like increase the I don't know, what would you call it, the haunting to a more aggressive level.
Bit of. I mean, yeah. It kills me how many teams will jump to poltergeist when a poltergeist is something we manifest. So, I mean, give me a house where the doors are opening and closing and the cupboards are going crazy, because I've never had it. And God, how old am I now? So I'm dating myself here. 42 years of doing this. I have never had that happen, ever. I've had a door close. I've walked into a room and silently a cabinet was open, but not everything gone bananas. That's like movie stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you've in the past you've spoken about how there could be like, would you like to say dead Uncle Fred? Dead Uncle Fred.
Yep.
He was a funny man. He liked to
Yep.
do certain things to like kind of mess with you, or see if you notice something, and like maybe
Yep.
you guys were close, maybe you guys had like a certain relationship, and he's passed
Yep.
away, and then like maybe he's afraid that like maybe you've forgotten about him, so let me just kind of like, or like
Yeah.
maybe he misses you, and he's like, hey,
Yeah.
I want you to think about me, so slowly opens a cabinet door, and you're like, ah, there he
Right.
is. And it's not anything violent or aggressive or
Right.
scary, or it's just a guy that was funny when he was alive, and when he's dead, he's funny when he's dead. You know,
Exactly. It's rare that you have a house with really, truly, really negative stuff. I grew up in one, but that's rare. It's really, really rare. Um, I talk on one of my podcasts. It was like one of the very first podcasts we did on the other. It's Speaking of Spirits. I think it was like episode 1 or 2 or 3 or something like that. I talk about the house that I grew up in, and that was an incredibly negative house. It, when my parents were looking, so we lived in San Fernando, right by Van Nuys. So when you said
Yeah.
Van Nuys, I'm like, I know Van Nuys because we had airplanes over there. So it was like, yeah, I'm really familiar with it, right? But I was little when my dad was on all these search and rescue missions. He was a pilot. He fell in love with the Lake Tahoe area, and he wanted to get us out of there. So that's when we moved up. So we went on this house hunting trip, and there was a beautiful area. It is a beautiful area. And I remember us driving down the road, and as we were getting closer and closer to the house, my mom was getting more and more uncomfortable. And I'm a little kid, but I'm in the back seat and I know what's going on because you can feel the tension. He
Yeah.
pulls into the front of the house, and my mom's like, I'm not getting out of the car. And he's like, what are you talking about? She goes, I'm not getting out of the car. We're not buying this house. And he looks at her, and I'll never forget this. He said, this is the only house we can afford. Get out of the car, Dottie. Like, oh, shit. Oh, I'm keeping mom because there's going to be a fight. To get out of the car. And my mom's like, you don't understand. The house is full. We can't own this house. The house is full. My mom was a psychic, a medium. Um, she also worked at the Hollywood's Haunted Castle for a while for as a medium. And it wasn't a
Yeah.
gag with her. She really was a medium.
She
She
really
really
was.
was.
Oh,
She's a psychic. She could, and later she became a detective and used all those gifts that she had as a cop,
that's
right?
that's crazy. You say that.
Yeah. So but she's like, we can't own this house. You don't understand how full this house is. And my dad, years later, he admitted, yeah, your mom was right about everything. Like, yes, yeah. So, the house was insanely dark. And it was years of all of this, I mean, terrible stuff that happened in this house. And I go into it in detail on that podcast. It was really dark. It was years before we found out that it was like, it had like 9 bedrooms, 4 bath. It was a big house. And they never could sell it. Well, no shit, because anytime anybody walked in
Yeah.
it, it was like, nope, everybody, it even sat like it was crouching. It was like
Really?
it did. Every time I walked down the road because we had to catch the bus way up the road, and I'd come down the road, and you came down around the driveway, and you're like, ugh, you just like, ugh. It always looked like it was ready to spring. The house looked like it was going to come forward on you. I hated that house. So, it was years later that my parents were told, well, this was a senior care facility at one time.
Ooh.
Bingo! A lot of death in that house, a lot. And we had a wheelchair ramp that came off the back, a big cement wheelchair ramp, and nobody we were I rode like I had those, god, they're so old now. I'm really dating myself. It was a Winnebago that the top opened, and it
Yeah.
had yeah, I
Yep.
rode that damn thing down that ramp all the time. I would
Oh,
sit on it and just sail down that ramp. Well,
those things
no,
are dangerous.
yeah, and it had these extra wide doors and everything. We never could. Well, it was because it was for wheelchairs. All the doors were wheelchair accessible. So that dark, dark, dark house, and um, my dad and I were walking probably about 5 years before he died. He died in 2020, and we were walking at another airport up in the mountains. It's walking the runway early in the morning. There's never, very little traffic up there, and we're walking, and he looks at me and he goes, that house is what caused the divorce of your mom and
Ooh.
I. And I went, really? And I said, now you say that? And he goes, yeah. He goes, I truly believe that that's why your mom and I's marriage fell apart, is because of that house. I would not believe how bad it was until the night where we had this huge incident. And then he still was like, nah. It was just that house. That house was bad. And even though my mom knew all of these psychics and all of these people that did all of these things, and they smudged it and cleaned it and smudged it and cleaned it, it would never, never be a good place. The property was just not a good place. The house was not a good place. But, you know, And that's why I tell people all the time, they'll call us and they'll say, can you come cleanse our house? I'm like, yeah, I can. But it doesn't mean that it's going to go away.
Yeah.
That activity can be there forever. And it may not even be related to you. Could be previous. It, it could be on the land. It may not even be you. It could be something somebody's sending to you.
Man, see, you say that about that house, and like the house was smudged, the house was this, you threw eggs at the house, and like the house still remained, and it just reminds me of a story about how there was this house that was very dark, for I don't know the history of the house, but it was just like very negative to where you pull up into the driveway and you can almost feel like, when you're at a concert and then the music is blasting and you feel it's almost like a
Feel the
feeling. You
beat.
feel it very low and it's hitting you. You're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay, something's off. So these people are experiencing severe negativity in this home. Everybody's sad, everybody's angry, nobody laughs. And
Yeah.
so they're calling people to cleanse it. They're calling people to do all kinds of stuff. And then this guy comes in and he says, this guy comes into the house, looks around, and then he walks out. And then the guy's like, well, what is it? And he says, I'm not going to charge you anything. I'm not going to do anything. He says, I'm going to give you some advice. And the guy goes, yeah. He says, you need to burn this house down. And, and then that was it. That's all he said. Like, basically saying, like, you can't help this place. Like, this place is done. And then that's what he said. He says, how can it, he says, you just need to burn this house down. And he walks out, he left. And there's just places where you just you just can't. It's almost like that stain in that wood that no matter what you do, it's never coming off. And you either learn to ignore it or you get rid of it.
Well,
You know.
and I kind of want to preface what I said too, because I do agree with you to a point, but there are people who are so skilled at blocking anything like this that they can walk into that house and never feel anything's wrong. So a lot of it has to do with your. I'm empathic, so if I'm next to somebody with anxiety, pretty soon I'm jumping out of my skin and I might not even know what's going on. If I walk by somebody who's just lost somebody, I feel their grief like, whoa, it comes through me like a veil. And so if that's me, and I'll feel the energy off of everything and everybody. But there's some people, I have a half brother, I call him the dead zone because there was never, he never felt anything. But the rest of everybody who came through that house was like, what the heck? They couldn't put their finger on what was wrong with that house. My parents were loving, it was full of parties and life and laughter all the time, and the house was negative. And yeah, so some people just they don't feel. They don't feel it. They don't maybe they haven't never allowed themselves, or maybe they don't have the ability to. They've never opened themselves up to feel it.
Or okay, so in is it? Oh man, sorry. Now my brain is kind of going. I wonder if it's the Iroquois, but they had their own shamans, and whenever there was they believed almost like it's crazy because they believe almost like what the people in El Salvador believe, that when there's negativity and there's all that kind of stuff, you're able to form it into a ball and it turns like into an actual being and you're able to make it run away, like get out of here. A lot of that was after warfare because the Native American lifestyle was warfare, like constant battling.
Mm-hmm.
So they brought a lot of negativity back. And some people believe out there that maybe that's where the shadow people come because they called it the shadow man. Like you bring like all that negativity is the shadow man, and they needed to be cleansed. So they had a special type of shaman, and this shaman, his ability was to not be either overtaken by the negativity or they just couldn't come near him. So he would like walk up to this place where all these people are suffering from this negativity or this area was very cursed. And this person's able, you can't send shamans out, the regular ones, because they're so feeling that they could become overwhelmed. So we're going to send this guy that has the ability to like basically like block it and repel it. And he's able to walk in and do a cleansing and he walks around and does whatever he does, not bothered. Did anything happen? Nope. Walks back, and then everybody else slowly inches their way closer to the area. And they're like, yeah, I think this area's fine. And it's just so like I almost said insane. It's just so interesting. I mean, I'm a skeptic in a lot of these kind of things, but it's just so fun, like to dwell in, like get in there and like, yeah, tell me more. You know what I mean? And then there's
Well,
people that
it's
are
go ahead.
they're skeptical, but they're skeptical because they're afraid. And you meet these people. These people are
Oh
like,
yeah.
I don't believe in it. Don't talk to me about it. It's stupid. You're all stupid. You're all crazy. And it's like, well, if I said, like, let me read you a chapter of Lord of the Rings, you don't like say, no, don't tell me it's fiction, and you don't walk off. There's something wrong with you. Like, you're afraid of it. And the reason why you're a skeptic and you are behaving this negative towards it is because it scares you, or you're in denial. You know what I mean? And even
Yeah.
though I don't believe in a majority of these things, I enjoy it because, again, I'm not afraid of it. A lot of these people out there that are that way, where they get angry, they get all these things, they're just secretly scared because they believe. They just don't want to believe.
We we had just it was just such a part of my life growing up with a mom with these kind of skills. And just to give your our listeners an example of how bonkers some of her abilities were, I mean, she was born this way, right? It's not something that came on later in life. She was born this way. And she could tell you, don't drive down this road tomorrow because this is going to happen. Or my dad was a test pilot. Your landing gear is not going to come down. Your right aileron is going to fail halfway through your flight. Be prepared. Whatever. It was just bump, 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 bump. And it was everybody she met. It wasn't, could be anybody. So, she also had this ability that's bananas because I've never seen anybody else have this ability. Uh, so my dad, when they were, early in the marriage, my dad, he was a pipe smoker, so he'd get his pipe out, have his coffee, read the paper.
Yeah.
She's across the TV from him, right? Or the kitchen table from him. He's reading the
Awesome.
paper. Yeah, he loved his pipes. And so, and he had the big handlebar mustache. It was so awesome. Anyway, he's got the headline open to her because she's across the table and he's reading the middle of the paper. And she's like freaking out. He's like, what's the matter? And she grabs the paper out of his hand. She's like, oh my God. He's like, what? She's like, Kennedy was killed? He goes, what are you talking about? So he's looking at the front of the paper and that article is not there. That article is not there, but she's described. He goes, what are you seeing? By now he's kind of accustomed to her telling him all of these things,
Yeah.
all of their friends and everybody knows, but mom's a little nuts,
And
but they listen to her because she's never wrong. And that's the
yeah.
thing,
So I
she's
was gonna
nuts, but
say,
she's
it's like
never
it's the
wrong.
the crazy
Yeah.
person. Like, she's a little nuts, but I'd listen to her.
Yeah,
Take that
yeah,
damn
listen
shirt
to
off.
her, go ahead and listen to her. So he writes down, he goes, well, describe the photo. And it was the photo of Jackie Onassis Kennedy climbing over the backseat of the Cadillac, and Kennedy slumped over. And the
Yeah, that's a
headline,
famous photo.
the assassination. And he goes, well, who wrote it? What's the byline, right? The author or the article. And so he wrote that down. And he just pinned it down on a notepad. And he said, well, Dottie, that's not what's there. And she's in tears, right? Because it didn't matter back in those days, right? What was that, 63 or whatever?
Yep.
The country wasn't divided. So even
Yeah.
though he could have been in an imposing, he was our president, and you know,
It was
somebody killed our president, and so
it was an attack on America. Those were some beautiful times,
it
really quick.
I know, right? And so
Man.
she's just
Yeah.
bawling, and she's like, "Oh my God!" And my mom was probably the same age as Onassis, real close, or so Jackie, and so the whole love affair with Camelot and the whole nine yards, and my mom's just bawling. She's a wreck. And he's like, I can assure you, Daddy, that's not. And so he had to read her what was on the front of the paper just to calm her down.
She's
That day
insistent.
it happened.
Yeah, it's crazy. I know
That
it.
day it happened. So the very next day, my dad gets the newspaper because it happened. And so he knows now it's happened. It happened that afternoon when they were at the. And so he's like, shit. So he unrolls the newspaper, and there it is. There's the
There's
photo.
that thing that she
And then he
saw. That
looks at
is.
the author, the byline. He's like, oh my God. And so she did this over and over and over. over constantly. And it's like I said, it wasn't just family, it wasn't just friends. She could pick up something. She had what do you call that? Uh Eidactic memory.
Yep.
Eidactic. So
Yeah.
she could read, not only was she was a speed reader, she could do this, but then she'd have it memorized. It would be
Yep.
like, yeah, freaking bananas. But she would read, she'd read stuff and then she'd hand it to me and I'm like, Mom, that's a zucchini recipe. I don't know what you just read, but that's not what's here. She constantly, but she
You
couldn't
know
read the
who?
lotto numbers.
Here's what's crazy. I'm gonna tell you something that's crazy. You know who else could do that?
Huh.
JFK. JFK was famous for
What?
glancing. Yeah, JFK was famous for glancing at newspapers, looking at it, and then setting it down, and then he's like, "Wait a minute," and then he like stop, and he was finished reading the paper in his head.
That's
So
bananas.
yeah, JFK was
Well,
famous for that.
my mom and her brother were Mensa members. So they were both like, I am so not that smart.
But the whole thing
It
with the
skips
lotto
a
numbers,
generation. Huh?
with the lotto numbers, because a lot of people say that it's like, well, with the lotto numbers, it's like in the timeline of important things, who cares who wins the lottery? It doesn't matter,
Yeah,
you
sure
know.
wouldn't to
But
me.
but yeah, well, it went up to you. But like somebody shook the. You know what's interesting is that what you said is that people would a lot of people were crying when Kennedy was shot because it was a blow to America, and back then people were a lot more patriotic. There wasn't
Yeah,
this big agenda. I mean, for example, when Truman, when he fired Douglas MacArthur, it cost him the election. Douglas MacArthur, famous
yeah,
World War II general,
right,
famous
right.
famous for the lines. He said, "I shall return." You know, when his tour was over,
Yeah,
and then he reenlisted, came back, and he's like, "I have returned," and he kept fighting. You know, so when Truman fired him and replaced him with somebody else, it cost him the election. People were like, "How dare you? He's a
yeah.
war hero," and it cost him the election.
So there's just a lot of things out there. A lot of people have a lot of gifts and they don't, maybe haven't tapped into them. Um, uh, you say you're a skeptic, but I don't I don't think you truly are. I think you've
Don't
had
say
enough
it.
experiences that you're just probably worried about them. You're like,
Oh,
okay, I know
jeez.
this shit's kind of real, and I mean, come on, who bought the haunted doll, Deacon?
Oh, okay. But anyways, but here's the thing: is like I said, I'm a skeptic with a lot of things, but uh, like I don't know what like sometimes like okay, so I'm gonna admit this. I'm gonna admit it for the first time here. One time we were recording me from my creepy attic, and I saw somebody. Well, I look over and I said, "Oh, there's a big rat," you know. And you remember that? I was like looking over, there's a big rat. I saw a person walk across the attic through the wall, and
Yeah,
I'm looking at him like, "Oh, I must be really tired." Um, and
yeah.
that was my reaction. I'm just like, just really tired, you know. And then I was like, well, and you're like, kind of looking at me. I think you kind of noticed something. I was like, oh, there's a big rat, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's it. I mean, yeah, I do experience a lot of things, but like I said, it's fun. I enjoy it. I'm a skeptic with a lot of things, but I do believe in some stuff. Like I do believe in like the folklore because like for example in El Salvador they have this thing called the cadejo, which is a black dog, you know
Oh God,
that
yeah.
yeah,
Oh
roams
boy.
around at night and you know and fiery
Yeah,
red eyes. And what are the odds that you have this? And this was also like people will say, well, it was probably like after the colonization of it. Like no, they have stories in the Nahuatl before before the actual contact with the Europeans. They had this already written down. They had drawings of it,
right.
and the only thing that happened when they met the Catholics when they actually took over was the story changed of where it came from. They're like, oh, the devil
Yeah,
created it. But to the people, to the indigenous people, this has always been there. That's what this is.
yeah,
And then when you look at, for example, folklore from Scotland, they have the same thing. Then you look at the folklore from the Native Americans, the same description, different names, same description. When you look at the British, they have the hellhounds, the hellhounds, all kinds of stuff, and they have like it's it's the same thing in different cultures around the world. I'm like, what are the odds that, is this coincidental that it smells the same, it
No.
looks the same? I don't believe in coincidences by
I
nature.
don't believe in coincidences either. And almost every single culture that I have studied the paranormal on, and I read all the time, has the same legends that went back centuries before trade ships.
Yeah,
Now some Celtic and some Norse and stuff like that, they didn't have a lot of written
yeah,
documentation, but of the old manuscripts that they could find, or the old, documents, or even not Native Americans were the only ones that did pictographs and petroglyphs. They're everywhere, right?
yeah,
So they would make these drawings of the same thing. So it's like, and this happened before trade. This
yeah.
happened before, yeah. So, when the flat earthers out there. So this happened before we got into ships and people were moving around the globe. So
But
now,
tinfoil hat.
yeah, myths and legends are based on some form of realism, like something happened. Now, have they gotten tweaked over the years? Sure,
Yeah,
but yeah,
it's there. And what's interesting is as I get older, believe a little bit more and more. Like I used to, as a teenager, I used to ridicule the stories the old man used to tell us. Oh, by the way, don't go here. It's a full moon, and the full moon, people act a little bit crazier. People get possessed by these spirits of nature, and then you're like,
ask a
whatever.
cop. Ask a
Exactly.
cop.
Like, ask a police officer. These people are called
Yeah.
lunatics. The full moon, you
Yep.
know. And yep, I have friends that are sheriffs, and then they're like, ugh,
Yep.
what's the matter? It's a full moon. This is an
Full moon.
interesting night.
Or we just entered Mercury retrograde a couple of days ago, and I've been feeling just like really down and out of sorts. I'm like, what the hell's going on, So I finally looked this up to see what's going on. I'm like, retrograde. Usually doesn't affect me this hard, but this one has. And those things, they affect water. Why can't they affect us? We're 70% water.
Yeah, that's wow. That is crazy that you say that. I never thought of that.
Yeah. So retrogrades can really screw with people. Mercury, especially when Mercury hits retrograde, right? I think it's 3 times a year, if not four, like 3.5 times a year, it hits retrograde. And man, when you hit some people, it affects more than others, but dang, this one was like my world was falling apart yesterday. And like, what the hell's going on? And finally, last night, I'm in bed and I look like, wait a minute, where are we right now with retrograde? I'm like, oh my God. Like 2 p.m. on the 23rd, we hit retrograde for Mercury. And I'm like, oh, that's it. And now a lot of people are like, bunkus, right? But if the moon is affecting the tides, why can't these planet alignments affect us?
You know, it is one of those things where, like, like I was just saying, the police officers will say it's the old man of the, in places like Salvador have these men that are kind of like they're like the village wise men, or they like get together and they they give people advice, and one of the advice is it's a full moon, don't go out there. These spirits are not only restless, but they can make you feel things that you wouldn't normally feel. Like they can make you angry or nuts and all that kind of stuff. And so stay inside. It's a full moon. And it's just things like that. And then you're like, oh well, I guess I might as well stay inside. But as a teenager, I thought it was ridiculous. I'm like, this is dumb. But then as I get older, I'm kind of like, hmm, yeah,
Well,
that makes
so I'm
that makes
telling people
sense.
that, especially this time of the year, we're getting closer and closer to Samhain, which is Halloween, right? The old name for Halloween is Samhain, and that is this time from about the end of August through about February. The veil is very, very thin between the worlds. Allegedly, I believe in it, but our as a paranormal group, everybody thinks we should be really active in Halloween. No, it's after for us. It's always after. Like all of the flurry of calls that come in through the year are basically November, December, January, February.
I've
It's
heard
that
that.
Yeah, it's like we're bonkers crazy then. And it could be with we're indoors, we're noticing what's going on in our homes more because it's winter. We're, in the summer we're all outside, but indoors all of a sudden we're like, "Hey, wait a minute, that door keeps shutting." So maybe we're noticing it, but it's believed that through the end of the year, that veil is pretty thin between worlds and things can come and go a little bit more easily. So if you have any gifts at all, you might experience more things
More,
fall and
yeah,
winter.
yeah. I'll have to
So,
put this. All right, we're gonna have to close out the show. My battery's gonna die, but man, it's
alrighty.
just somewhat. And it's these topics, man. Like I told you, I can talk about them for hours. There's so much. I have so many more stories, not only that I've read, but things that I've experienced, things that I know I've experienced. Like, for example, I'm gonna give you one more thing that I believe in, and you can laugh at me later, okay? I believe in
Haunted dolls?
skinwalkers.
Just saying.
Uh, uh, uh,
Oh.
I'll send it to your house. So like something like skinwalkers, people think
Oh
that
yeah.
skinwalkers, but in El Salvador they have witches that can like shapeshift, into different creatures, like everything from pigs to monkeys. I mean, even to this day, there's still a bounty on a witch called Fran- uh, uh, da, 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 Francisca Pancha, and
Well, you told me
she
about this. Yeah.
and and she has a cave,
Yeah.
and Juana Pancha is her name. So she has this cave up on the hill that no one dares goes there, and they're like, if you kill this witch, the government will reward you, and it's just kind of things, and they say, yeah, she'll morph into a monkey and she'll attack you. She can turn to a pig. She can do all these things, and to a lot of people that haven't looked into it, it might seem like stupid stories. Like this is the dumbest story I've ever heard until you start like getting into the legends of like Native Americans. You have the skinwalkers. They can morph into different creatures by putting on like the pelts of the, and then you get in places like in Ireland or Scotland in the marshes, they believe in something called a kelpie. So a kelpie
Yep.
is like this horse that drowns people. You hop on his back and then it runs into the water and it drowns you. But they say that shamans or druids that were like outcasts, because people need to understand that the druids of a certain era had a council. That way, there was like checks and balances. Somebody can't. Everything had to be. But then, when you were greedy, when if you were a druid and you were too greedy, you demanded more. They would cast you out, and then they would curse you. And then you want to act like an animal. You're gonna turn into one. And then he was out there, and then that's where they believe kelpies come from. That's one of the origins. So,
Yeah. So my family's go basically forever has been practicing druids. My father's side. So
and
they've
and
yeah. They they were the scholars, they were the educators,
yeah,
and they were also the disciplinarians. And
that's what I was gonna say. What I was gonna say is people see druids and they're like, "Oh, that's all." But to be a druid, you had to have a really good brain because you had to memorize a lot of things. You had to memorize not just incantation. You had to memorize law. You need to understand like not just the law from that area. People need to understand that in the Germanic culture or in the culture of the Picts or the culture of the Gaelics the Gaels, they had different regions, and they all would listen to the Druids. So like they would go to war with each other, but then the Druids would come in. They're like, "Okay, stop. We need to have a council meeting," and they would all come together. And it's like, okay, according to your law, this section here, this is what's going on, and your law here, and then they would kind of like memorize the laws of every single tribe, and they would have a council meeting, and they would listen to them because these were like the voice of reason. And then they would like decide like what was the consequence, what needs to happen, and it's like, well, this is
yeah,
going to cost you this many crops. You have to give it to this person because according to your law, the percentages are off. So to be a druid, you have to be a really smart individual. People see
yeah,
they hear druids and they think like hocus pocus BS, but
right.
they were the they were the law keepers. So much so that in the see now here I go, I'm such a nerd. In the book Caesar, Caesar would encounter these barbarians that he said, these barbarians and their druids, it's insane. But I have my own druids that he came from this area here, and he's gonna actually explain how you actually read
My
this.
druids are better than your druids.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like and all he was a druid that wanted to incorporate the Roman society and basically like have them like put an alliance. Okay, but I'm gonna need to go with you. Study your law. Study your entire law. They have thousands of laws, and I will come with you during campaigns. But instead, was this pleasing you? I will come here, and I will meet with them, and we will all have a meeting. And then Caesar himself was. You can't really argue with a man this wise. So he would sit there and he would listen to this druid of his the better druid because he actually studied and memorized all the Roman laws from different sections because Rome's divided in different areas and they all had different laws and different customs. And this druid had to memorize everything and then just have a sit down with these people and he would discuss it. So, quick history on druids, guys. All
Well,
right, I'm gonna
I like
let's
this topic. I thought it was great. I'm hoping that people aren't upset that we're kind of straying away from murder once in a while, but
just need to get away from it for a while. It really messes up.
it's
Next
dark.
episode will be murder. Yeah, next episode we'll I'll be depressed again. All right, so thank you guys for listening. I am one of your hosts. I am Decon, and I was here with a very spooky druid.
SOS.
And remember, guys, to always look both ways, especially if you find yourselves on Nightmare Road.